Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Role of Logistics, Supply Chain, and Cash and Voucher Assistance, or CVA programming. This webinar is organized by the TOPS program, a USAID Office of Food for Peace funded program seeking to build the capacity of FFP grantees and other food security and nutrition implementers. Before we begin, I'd like to encourage all attendees to post their questions in the chat box during the webinar. All questions will be answered during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Finally, to begin, I'd like to turn it over to Birendra Kumar Dey, Commodity Management Advisor for the TOPS program.
Hi, my name is BK Dey. I am the Commodity Management Advisor with the TOPS program. Over the past years, in addition to doing capacity building on commodity management, we have also done events on market-based programs in collaboration with CALP, the Cash Learning Partnership. We have done both in DC as well as in regional knowledge sharing meetings, starting with Dakar, Senegal, then Uganda, and the last one was in Bangkok. When we were doing the commodity management training in different countries, the primary audience was the commodity management staff from different organizations. One question that we have received again and again was, is there a role for the commodity management staff in modalities other than in-kind food? And that is when we have been toying with the idea of organizing a webinar to talk about what role the logistics and supply chain staff can play in market-based programs. So it took some time. We have been thinking about it, planning about it for a long time. So finally, I'm glad that we got Charity Lukaya. She is the Senior Manager, Regional Humanitarian Capacity Building for Save the Children. She travels a lot, and it took some time to get a mutually agreeable date when we could have her. But I'm glad that we could make it work. So we have Charity Lukaya, who will be doing this webinar. And here you go, Charity, take it over.
Thank you, BK, for your generous introduction. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the next 55 minutes of interacting and sharing. Kim has taken you to do how you can interact with the platform. So you can either raise your hand, or you can actually type in the chat box if you have any questions during the webinar, and we'll be able to respond to you. As BK has put it, I'm the Regional Senior Manager for Humanitarian Capacity Building for East and Southern Africa. But prior to that, I worked with the Cash Learning Partnership. And that's where my experience in training for cash and voucher assistance comes from. So just to start us off, okay, one moment, looks like my slide is not moving. Just give me 1 second. Okay. I would like to make a few acknowledgements. One is to the materials we're going to use today for the 1-hour webinar are not property. So we've amalgamated some content from the Cash Learning Partnership. We also have some content from the Fritz Institutes, who are who run the supply the co-cash and voucher assistance skills training for operations staff, which is supply chain, finance, and ICT. And also we do have some material from the Global Wash Cluster. So just to make sure that you're aware that this is not our own 100% our own creation. So we'll be looking basically welcome and introductions, which has been done. And then we'll be looking at the introduction to market-based programming. And then we'll be looking at RACI, consulted and informed as far as market-based programming is concerned, and so as far as supply chain is concerned. Now, I'd like to put across a quick disclaimer when we look at the learning outcomes. So this webinar, as BK has mentioned, was meant to be an introduction to market-based programming and cash for supply chain staff. So it's basically targeting people who are really, really new in cash and voucher systems and or including, market-based programming, including cash and voucher systems. So it's not, it's going to be very basic. I have seen some people who have signed up for the course are really experienced. And so you will be at liberty to either sit in with that information or to drop off. So basically we'll be thinking of defining cash and voucher systems, thinking about what is market-based programming, and then we'll be explaining the role of logistics and supply chain, and then we'll give an example of a stream of work undertaken by logistics or supply chain in cash and voucher systems. And here we'll be looking at the Save the Children global cash transfer solution as one of examples of piece of work that has been done and is managed through supply chain for cash and voucher programming. As I mentioned, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat box. So we'll start looking at the market-based programming framework. I'll start by just explaining very briefly that market-based programming framework actually looks at how we can use the markets during recovery, during development work, and also during emergencies, to both make sure that we are strengthening the markets for future use during other emergencies, but also when we are programming during emergencies, how are we ensuring that we are contributing to strengthening of the markets. One of the things that happens is the improvement of the supply, of the market supply. And here we actually look at a couple of things that you can be able to do to improve supply or the supply side of the market. So you could do local purchases from the market. So when you're doing your in-kind programs, instead of bringing your goods from, I don't know, where you can actually purchase from the local markets, and that is able to, you're able to use that market and you're able to utilize the market and strengthen it. And then you could do voucher programs. You're still using the market because then you are being able to make sure that the traders are still involved in the programming, and then you're strengthening their ability to continue operating. You can provide support to traders, and here you can give grants to traders. Support can be in different ways. You can give grants to traders. You can be able to do training and give grants for them to start up business. Or you can actually provide grants to traders for them to be able to provide the particular goods and services that are needed on the market. You could support production, and this is one of the things that you could do during your either recovery or normal development programming, to make sure that the market has whatever needs to be produced for that particular market. And then you can be able to support the supply and value chain. And this is where you, as an organization, you may decide to put in a value addition program. Sorry, you can hear. Can you please mute yourselves? I can hear an echo that is coming in. Thank you very much. So you can support the supply and value chain either by doing value addition, or you can be able to do things that actually make things move. Yeah, you can be able to support warehousing, you can be able to support movement, or you can be able to support all those kinds of things. Very, very related to that, we'll look at the infrastructure, which are also some of the things that you can be able to do. But this is just for you to make sure that the market is functioning and that the supply of goods and services is actually continuous. In some of our programs, like the nutrition programs or the health programs, this can actually be training of healthcare providers to make sure that you have enough of them in the system to offer services. It could be setting up of maybe centers to make sure that people can be able to access, working with, say, local hospitals or local schools to make sure that education can, so just being able to make sure that you're supporting the supply of goods and services onto the market. On the demand side of things, you can either use the market, still support the market, or develop the market. And this you can do by either generating new demand or improving existing demand. And how do you do this? One of the things you can do is cash and voucher. So one, be able to utilize the market so that they can be able to, you increase the demand so people can be able to go and buy goods and services. You can improve access by making sure that you're bringing markets maybe closer to the people, and then people can be able to access the markets much better. Or you can change and improve behaviors. And this is where you're creating demand by, say, if you do a wash program that has, say, hygiene component of hand washing, and you make sure that everyone is able to adopt hand washing, then those people are hand washing with soap, and then the people are actually going to go to the market and buy soap, yeah? So you do a behavior change program that can actually be able to increase the demand of a particular product from the market. And then when you talk about improving market services, this is where you're going to check that infrastructure is restored, or develop develop new infrastructure. A good example would be maybe access roads. Yeah, so for example, we know that if floods happen in a particular area, especially for recurring disasters, we know that floods happen, this bridge is usually not there, or there's water that then cuts off this market from maybe the supply market, from the market chain, from the market system, sorry, then we can be able to do that. You can be able to say, let's construct the road so that, or let's construct the bridge so that during the next rainy season, there is no problem with transportation, for example. We can be able to do, make sure that we are working with the traders for them to access loans. So we have the livelihoods and entrepreneur or enterprise programs that organizations run. And then we can be able to see how do we link the traders on that market with credit so that they can be able to continuously have ability to actually restock. So we can link them up with microfinance. We have organizations that actually have a microfinance component to their programming, which is something that they do during normal development programming as part of resilience, that can actually be very, very useful when it comes to emergencies, because then the traders have ability to stock and restock. We could look at rehabilitating roads. I've talked about that. We could look at maybe setting up phone masts for, telecommunication masts. We could look at ability to provide information, yeah, because sometimes it's also because people don't have market information that they're not able to make, the traders are not able to make informed decisions around demand and supply of particular goods and services. And then the last bit of the market-based programming framework is looking at strengthening the regulatory environment. And this is most of the time advocacy work that we do to make sure that there's reforms in the environment. So things like taxes, Oxfam is known for doing a lot of work around taxes, tax to farmers, things around advocating for fuel price reduction, advocating for favorable policies for farmers or traders within a particular environment, thinking through ability to talk through other things like cross-border trade and all those kinds of things, so that we make sure that the regulatory environment and the socio-political environment is conducive for the markets to operate during an emergency, so that we don't have blockages that are as a result of the socio-political environment. And so looking at this, we talked about cash transfer. And when you talk about cash transfer here, we mean both cash and voucher. programming as one of the ways, just one of the tools that we could be able to use in market-based programming. And so we'll go now down to it and look at what cash is. So I know most of you have interacted with this, but I just wanted to reiterate that cash is not a sector. Cash is actually a tool. It's a modality, and it can be used alone or in combination with other modalities. So we could use cash, we could use vouchers in combination with in-kind change programming, so what we call cash plus. So we may decide to do a cash program plus maybe an awareness program for a behavior change program in terms of awareness for antenatal care or awareness for hand washing campaigns that we do together with the cash program. It's one of delivering assistance, but it's not a sector. Like I've mentioned, we cannot call it a sector. It's just a tool. It's just a way of us being able to deliver assistance. Okay. Kim, if you could put through. So we are going to just do a small poll, and the idea is just to sense check where we are at with some of the basics of cash and voucher programming, basically some of the terminologies. So if you could just quickly answer the poll question and submit. Thank you.
Okay, great. We're getting a lot of responses. I'm just going to leave the poll up for just a few more moments.
I hope everyone can be able to see the poll. If you can't, please raise your hand. Thank you. Thank you. So show the following the modality. Okay. Thank you, Kim. The next one.
Okay, thank you. We're getting some responses. I'm just going to leave the poll up for a few more moments.
Okay. Thank you, Kim. So if you could just leave that, one up, Kim. Just leave the second poll up. Results. Thank you. Yeah. So basically, I just wanted to check in terms of terminologies and what do we mean when we talk about a modality, and what do we mean by when we talk about a delivery mechanism. So some of you have actually mentioned that cash for work is a delivery mechanism, and I did see a few of you also in the previous None of you thinks paper voucher is a delivery mechanism. Then cash in envelopes 12%, bank cards 4%, mobile money 35%, and vouchers 19%. Okay, just take it down. Kim, thank you. So we'll just quickly look through the key terminologies. Yeah. So this is the new terminology map that has just been mapped up by CALP in 2018. Initially, we had a different one. Some of you might have seen the other one, but there is the new one, which is here. So a couple of things that you need to look at, and I'll do that. Yeah. So when you look at cash, we think about two things, cash and vouchers. So we think about two things. We think about restriction and we think about conditionality. Yeah. So restriction is basically how is the money and or voucher used. Yeah. And so automatically vouchers are restricted because a voucher provides you with things that you're supposed to do within it, and cash is unrestricted. Initially, I think we used to talk about a little bit about that differently, but now it's just been agreed that when you talk about restricted, you don't have to say restricted voucher. Yeah? A voucher is automatically restricted. So when you talk about modality, this is a form of assistance provided to recipients. So it can either be cash, in-kind, service delivery, or vouchers, okay? So a voucher is a modality, cash is a modality, in-kind is a modality, service delivery is a modality. Now, cash for work will be a modality and it will not be a delivery mechanism. Delivery mechanisms means how do you then get that assistance to the person, to the affected community. So how are we getting the assistance to the communities that are affected by whatever we are dealing with? And so this is where then we are looking at the methods of actually either payment. So how are we paying them, for example, if it's cash, yeah? And this is delivery mechanisms are both e-cash and cash in hand. So cash in hand is what is in other terms called cash in envelopes. So this is where you actually give physical cash. You could give physical cash yourself as an organization. So we have distributions where you actually go set up camp, have people who are registered coming in and are being paid whatever amount of money they're supposed to pay you as an organization. So Save the Children, NRC, Oxfam will actually do that using your staff members. You could also do cash in hand using other service providers. So you could do mobile bank. In terms of the bank, you get into an agreement with the bank and the bank physically goes to a village to distribute cash on your behalf. In other places, it has been done through security firms like G4S, where they do the actual distribution. But at the end of the day, the beneficiaries are receiving cash. So they're being given cash. They line up, they sign, they get their cash. E-cash can be done through mobile money. So this is where examples of T-Cash, M-Pesa, and all other forms of money transfers that happen on phones. And this is where the recipients receive whatever amount of money they're supposed to receive on their phones, and then they go and withdraw that money from various agents in accordance to whatever is available within their countries and within their locations. They could also be able to do that through digital payment platforms. And this is where recipients are given cards, and then they go and redeem at different places. So we could work with traders, for example, who have point of sale machines, POS, point of sale service machines, and they could actually use their cards to redeem whatever is on those cards. And then we could also have banks. So banks would also be one of that. And banks could be, this is where we are talking about bank accounts, and beneficiaries are given ATM cards, and or they can actually go and withdraw money from the bank itself. So that becomes a delivery mechanism. In terms of vouchers, you have what we call, in the modality, we have commodity vouchers and value vouchers. So a commodity voucher, example of a commodity voucher will be a voucher where, say, we've put in and said, redeem 7-gallon, 20-liter gallons of water, yeah? And it's basically you're going to present your voucher and get your 7 20-liter gallons of water, and that is ticked. And that is it. That is our commodity voucher. Or redeem 1 kilogram of maize, 2 kilograms of, I don't know, pearls, whatever pearls, and maybe 2 pieces of soap. So it's basically very, very clear that you're going to redeem the commodities that are on the voucher. A value voucher will be that you're given a voucher worth 100 shillings, maybe Kenya shillings. I'll use Kenya shillings. That is $1 thereabout. You're given a voucher of say $5, and then you can redeem whatever is you're allowed to redeem within that voucher up to the value of $5. So for instance, if your voucher is, you're entitled to hygiene items, you might actually have in their soap, you might have in their sanitary pads, you might have in their toothbrush, toothpaste. So you might actually go to the vendor and decide you want 1 soap, 2 packets of sanitary pad, and 1 toothpaste, because you already have a toothbrush. You don't need to buy a toothbrush. Or you can actually decide, no, I actually want 3 bars of soap and no sanitary pad, because maybe in my household there's no one who is of menstruating age, and then you can decide to say, okay, I just want 3 bars of soap, toothpaste, and toothbrush, but all of it will amount to the value that the voucher is, which is $5. Now, in terms of the delivery mechanisms for vouchers, we have both paper vouchers and e-vouchers. So a paper voucher is basically that. It's printed on paper. And this is where a lot of work in supply chain comes in, and we'll see that later. So we have the printing of the vouchers, which is the voucher either with the amount on it or with the value on it. A few years ago in Kenya, we had a situation where there was a paper voucher going around, and it was valued, put in, the value on it was 150 and 20, and there was quite a big uproar in the development world, because it was deemed to be a separate currency, but it's not really a currency. It's just that the value on it was 100. So if you go to the shop, that is worth 100 Kenya shillings. Or on it, it will be the number of whatever gallons of water or food that you're supposed to pick. E-vouchers are electronic, so you could have them with an Android device, and then you tap, or with a card. Yeah, it could be a card or an Android device, so you could get it on your phone, or you could get the voucher in form of a card, and then you tap and it can also still be, you can be entitled, it can be value, I mean, it can be value, it can be commodity, but at least the only difference is that it's an e-voucher, so it's not paper. So you're not carrying around a piece of paper that you're going to redeem. So just quickly to expound on that, just being able to see direct cash. We've talked about cash in envelopes. You can have checks on money orders. Paper voucher, electronic cash. We've talked about the cards. We've talked about bank accounts with ATM cards or bank accounts for people to go actually and get the money from the bank. You have smart cards and you have mobile money. Paper vouchers, we've talked about the printed paper voucher, but you can also use scratch card, and when you scratch, it tells you you redeem 10 soaps, or you redeem 5 soaps, or something like that. And then electronic vouchers, it can be in form of cards, but it can also be in form of mobile vouchers, so that you get the code on your phone and then you tap it onto an Android device. I'll pause there to see if there's anyone with any question before I can proceed to the next piece of that we need to look at. So if you have any question, you can either ask or you can type. Give a few seconds for that. Should I take the silence to mean that we don't have any questions?
No, we don't have any questions at the moment.
Okay.
Oh, Charity, we have one question. The question reads, can you clarify a bit more about the restricted and unrestricted modalities that you shared in the previous slide?
Okay, thanks. Like I mentioned, restriction is basically how is the assistance utilized? Yeah. Do we allow the beneficiary or the affected people to actually do what they want with it, or do we control what? Not control. Control is a really bad one. Do we manage what they use it for? So when you give cash, so for example, if you give people cash in envelopes, that's cash in hand, or we give them cash through their mobile phones, we cannot follow them to their houses and say, okay, now you have to spend that cash on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things. So that is unrestricted. Once they get the money, they do with it what they want to do with it. Yeah. Restricted is being able to manage what they use that assistance on. So this is where vouchers are introduced, and you can actually then say you can only use the voucher for. So if it's water, you can only redeem the voucher for water. You cannot use the same voucher to go and redeem, say, maize. Yeah. So unless it's an electronic voucher, but also if it's an electronic voucher with wallet, you can only use up to the amount that is in that wallet. So for example, if you have it loaded with something for food security, so maybe that is maybe $5 for food, and then $5 for hygiene items, and then $5 for water, and then maybe another $5 for maybe nutrition, maybe things like fresh foods. They can only redeem up to $5 of that voucher for whatever is restricted in that wallet. Yeah. So they are not able to actually then say, I can use the voucher for anything else whatever I want. They can only use that voucher for the purpose that you've given them to use. And that's where the restriction comes in. So we give them the assistance, and then we use the assistance for maybe sometimes it's because we want to achieve particular outcomes with that particular grant, and that is why we introduce restriction. We might actually tell them you can only redeem shelter, iron sheets, and they can only redeem iron sheet. The restriction comes in. I hope that clarifies it. I've seen someone say, I believe that is called conditional cash transfer. No, conditional cash transfer, conditions are different. Condition is once the person or the household has been identified as a beneficiary, what is it that they have to do before they get the assistance? So for instance, we say, we're going to give you a voucher for fresh foods if you attend a cooking class or a hygiene. Maybe you want to promote hygiene, a proper hygiene during cooking. So you said, okay, your household is a beneficiary already. You've been targeted, you've been identified, and you've been selected as one of the households to benefit from this intervention. However, you must attend a cooking class before you are given the voucher, or must attend school for this number of days before your family gets the cash. So the condition is what their assistance. Restriction is how do they utilize it? Is it free? So for instance, you could do, you could attend school and get cash. So that is conditional and unrestricted. But person could attend a cooking class and get a voucher. So that is conditional and unrestricted. Or you could just all get vouchers without doing anything for it. So they just give everyone who is in the program a voucher. That's unconditional, but it is restricted. So the condition is what the beneficiary has to do before they get the assistance after they are part of the program. And restriction is what they use the assistance for. I hope that clarifies, yeah? Okay, great. So I'll move on to the next thing, which is really looking at roles and responsibilities within cash and voucher programming. And we'll use a matrix that we call a RACI, and this is looking at who is responsible, accountable, consultant, and informed. And this just helps us to see how can we get involved more in cash and voucher programming. So when you talk about supply chain is responsible, then it means that you might be doing the work, so you are the one achieving the task. But then if you're accountable, then you're ultimately answerable through to the completion of that task. So there are areas where you might be accountable and still be the one responsible for doing it. There are other areas where you might be responsible for just a task, the person accountable for the overall. And then there are areas where are you consulted and where are you just informed. So at what point do programs people just inform you, and at what point do they consult you during cash and voucher programming. We'll use the project cycle. We'll use the project cycle as one of the, as working through the responsibilities, accountabilities, and consultations and information sharing. So we'll start off, we'll look at 4 main areas: preparedness, assessment and analysis, design and implementation, during distribution, and monitoring feedback. And we'll look through what will be the role of supply chain in all these 5 stages. So in terms of preparedness, we have a few preparedness activities here. So we have ready to go solutions. So supply chain will be involved in conducting baseline assessments and monitor market prices. So we do have baseline assessments, especially retail market assessments, pre-crisis, what we call the pre-involved in that. And ideally, I know it happens differently in different organizations, but ideally supply chain should lead the market assessment piece of work and market monitoring piece of work. And then in terms of contingency planning, supply chain will be involved in identifying risks and mitigating measures. And here we are looking at operational risks that can actually need to be mitigated or need to be put in mind when we are programming. This is a responsibility, not an accountability, because there will be other risks. So there will be both programmatic risks, operational risks, organizational risks, contextual risks. Some of them will be security risks. So you are not entirely accountable for all the contingency planning, but you are accountable for being able to look at the operational risks that might come with a particular cash and voucher program. And then being able to have ready-to-go solutions. So ready-to-go solutions are things that we need to use like very, very fast when we have an emergency. And here is being able to establish frameworks of agreements with service providers. So that would be the accountability of supply chain, being able to make sure that we have frameworks of agreements with service providers so that we can be able to use them very quickly during an emergency, because the process of actually getting a service provider on board is very lengthy. And if we don't have frameworks of agreements in place, then it's very, very difficult for us to be able to use them during an emergency. And of course, being able to establish SOPs, and these might be SOPs that are maybe emergency SOPs, so being able to adapt some of our SOPs, like our procurement processes, like our procurement policy, that can be used during an emergency. We have an alternative to normal procedure that is in place for us to use. Assessment and analysis. Here we are looking at the things that we need to check before we say yes, we can actually go ahead. We'll be looking at feasibility checks, and this is where we are looking at, is cash feasible, and out from the operations side to check if cash is feasible. And this is where we are looking at operational feasibility. Are the markets functioning? And that is one of the key things that supply chain will be responsible for. And then of course thinking about financial service providers in terms of their availability. That's also something else that supply chain will be involved. Retail market assessments that have to be done, and this is now during the emergency. So we need to do rapid market assessments to check if the traders and the goods and the services are still available on the market, and we can actually be able to use cash and voucher programming. I've put security there because in some organizations we have security falling under logistics. And so it will be in those instances where we don't have a standalone security department, then it will be under logistics that will be looking at security assessments. Can we access the area? Are we able to do cash in that area without causing more harm to either the communities or to our own staff? And then analysis, this is not an accountability of supply chain, but supply chain provide information that goes into response options analysis. And this is where you actually analyze all the data that you've collected and make a decision in terms of, okay, are we going to do cash, voucher, in kind, yes or no? And if it's cash, which kind of cash programming are we going to do? Are we going to do vouchers? Do we have the, a framework of agreement with a printer for vouchers, or do we have a framework of agreement with a company that gives us electronic vouchers and what's not? So here, supply chain provides recommendations from their previous assessments that we can be able to use, programs people are able to use to make a decision in terms of what modality and what delivery mechanism they are going to use. Sorry, I'm running through this because of time. So here, when you're doing design and implementation setup, an action plan, sometimes it's called an operational plan, sometimes it's called something else in different organizations. But this is where supply chain really has a big role to play, because within the plan, we are looking at, for instance, now if we've decided we are going to do cash in envelopes. So this will have a very detailed plan on when are we going to do deliver them, how are we going to do it, how many people do we need to do it, what kind of facilities do we need, what transportation do we need. So you have to be very, very involved here in the action plan. And then there's contracting suppliers and partners. And here for supply chain, you're really looking at the suppliers. And suppliers, yeah, service providers. So we are talking about the mobile phone companies that you might be using for mobile money. We're talking about traders that you might be using for the vouchers, or people might be using for delivery of the digital payment, money through digital payment platforms. We are thinking about contracting G4S, for example, to deliver money on our behalf. So contracting processes for those suppliers, our service providers will be done, will be the accountability of supply chain. We've talked about SOPs as well, and this is being able to review and build into program SOPs so that we make sure they're aligned with the SOPs that we have within our operations. And then implementation setup, we are thinking about distribution support mechanisms, being able to set up a distribution plan, being able to support programs to do the actual distribution. And of course, supporting beneficiary identification and registration. And this is, if people are going out to the field to do, identification and registration of beneficiaries, supply chain will be responsible for the movement of those people, for ensuring that the security of those people is provided, and ensuring that they have all the supplies that they need to do the registration. So I've just put here a quick thing on service provider assessment. And I know some of the service provider assessments might not be done by supply chain, but the whole process of being able to do a tender, a call for service providers is done by supply chain. Then if they are, say, a financial institution like a bank, we have to work with the programs team and the finance team to be able to do the assessments. And then we have to come down and think about what that service provider is going to do, the specifications, bill of quantities for the service provider, and then go down to being able to contract that service provider. When you talk about the client here, the client can be the program's team, can be anyone else. So the client will be the person with the technical expertise who knows what they want, and the procurement and or supply chain people are the people who actually enable the process of getting this person on board. So basically you just look at it in that perspective. I have put here this because it's a very, very important thing, and I'll send the link out after the webinar, but we have the CALP Program Quality Toolbox, which really has tools, guidance, and more information on what you could be able to do when you're selecting a delivery mechanism. So it has information around contracting, it has information around what do you look at when you're looking at a mobile service provider, which can really, really be good when you're developing your TORs or your BOQs, whichever way you look at it. Looking at distribution, and we've talked about being able to support that, and we have a matrix where you know where are you distributing, which day, how many vehicles do you need, how many people do you need, how long does it will you distribute and stay there, do you need accommodation, and all those kinds of things. And then in terms of monitoring, it's very, very important. The key role here for supply chain is market monitoring, being able to look at both trader monitoring and breaks in the supply chain. So that implementing, it doesn't stop there. We have to make sure that we are constantly monitoring to check if our program is doing any harm to the market so that we can be able to change. Otherwise, we cause other problems like inflation and things like that. And of course, if you find any key things, then you're supposed to make recommendations to the programs team to adjust the programming. So this is where if you're doing cash and vouchers, you might actually be able to say, no, let's actually revert back to in-kind. And you will go back to the normal in-kind processes of supporting programs. I put this here because to just show us pictorial representation of how cash and in-kind work for logistics and supply almost different. So for in-kind, which is the top part, is you procure, you ship, you put in the warehouse, then you distribute. For cash, you actually get the money. So you do the cash pipeline where you make sure if, for example, the amount within your country office or your field office, you might require to ask for the money from your HQ, which comes to the country office, and then comes to the country office, maybe goes to, comes down to the field office, and then you now do the encashment process. And this is where once you have the money, then you're thinking about the process of distributing the money to the beneficiary. So whichever delivery modality you're using. So here it might mean you get the money, or it might actually mean that the cash pipeline is from the bank somewhere in Nairobi or in the UK, the money goes directly to the service provider. If you're sending the money to the a bank, for example, is your service provider, and then the bank does the actual encashment process. If you're doing cash in envelopes as an organization, it means it comes through your bank, it comes from the HQ, comes to your bank, and then once you have it in your bank, you have to go withdraw the money and then do the process of encashment. I'll quickly run through what encashment is. So it's the process of cashing money order, bond notes, or other financial instruments. So we talk about it either as cash distribution planning, disbursement planning. You'll hear other people talking about distribution planning. So whichever terminology is used, it just means encashment. Cycle, and it ends when that cycle has been reconciled, paid, reported, and closed. So it's all from the finance team, the money will come in, and then the role of supply chain will come in terms of the distribution aspect, being able to get the vehicles, the security, and the venues for the distribution ready, and then that cycle will end when that particular distribution has been reconciled. I'll put this here. So this is just for you to be able to look at an example of a distribution planning tool where you're looking at what are the things that will be taking place. So for example, funds transfer will happen, and then SIM activation will happen, and then we'll distribute the SIM cards. So you are realizing if you're doing a voucher, you'll have two sets of distribution. The first one is when you are distributing the actual vouchers. So you have the vouchers printed, you have to distribute the vouchers to the beneficiaries, and then the beneficiaries will go and redeem goods happening. If you're doing money, distribute SIM cards, and then the people will go and redeem, now get the money from there. But also if you're doing cash in envelopes, you'll be distributing the actual money that the beneficiaries are getting. So those are just the things to put in mind from a supply chain point of view. And then after you've done that, you will test and update your system. So you confirm responsibility, make sure you know how long it takes to do a cycle of distribution, factoring in all the other possible things that can go wrong, yeah? And then you plan your timeline planning as a result of, so if we were to distribute next week on Friday, if we were to distribute after 2 weeks, how long should we make a requisition? Then you inform the programs people, they need to make a requisition on this date because our distribution is going to take 5 days in this area because of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 logistical issues that are in place, so that then we are not having teams in the field that have run out of money. So you have to constantly be in communication with programs and finance teams on this one to make sure that it's going on smoothly. So just quickly after each distribution, make sure you're sitting down as a team and checking what went wrong, what didn't go well. Are there any issues? Are there any documents that needed to be there for you guys from a supply chain perspective that have not been there before the next distribution cycle? So if you need more distributions, you repeat the same process. And then in terms of feedback, exit and feedback, supply chain then here is not your accountability, but you do contribute to the reports that are written and the documentation that is needed. When you have audits, we'll need all the documents on how we procured the service provider, on how we procured the vouchers, on how we procured all that. So we must make sure that all the records are there. Program quality toolbox with all that. This, which is something that we will share with you, and this is the it shows which we'll share an interactive version with you guys, and it shows us which who is responsible for what, responsibilities and accountability for different options. You could see supply chain is the one in light blue. So when you hover over on the one that we'll share with you, for the interest of time, I cannot be able to show you, but you will see what are you accountable for, what are you consulted on. In the interest of time, I will not share the global cash transfer solution done by Save the Children, but it's basically a process where Save the Children has actually gone through a process of having a framework of agreement with service providers, global framework of agreement with 3 or 4, Segovia, MasterCard, and another one. And it's just helping us, and it's been done by the procurement team within Save the Children to make sure that we are cutting down on the process of procuring service providers. So the only thing we do is schemes of work, which we attach to the global framework, and we are good to go. So I'll stop there for questions, if there are any.
Yes, we do have a few questions in the chat box.
But I'll be able to share that example from Save the Children.
Okay, great. We do have a few questions in the chat box. Just a reminder for everyone to put their questions in the chat box if they have any. If we don't have time to answer everyone's questions, we will collect them and then send out a Q&A document after this webinar. One of the questions we had was, banknotes that have sophisticated security systems are sometimes imitated. How do we ensure vouchers are not imitated?
Yeah, so that means you have to put in a lot of security components. So one other thing is to be able to put security features like a watermark, being able to do vouchers that are different every month or for every distribution cycle. So if you're giving vouchers to be redeemed monthly, you might want to do them with different colors. Make sure you're doing them closer to the timing. Put in other security features like a watermark, or think about other ways that you're doing that. Also be able to vet the people who are printing your vouchers for you, so that you're covering possibility of fraud from both angles, in terms of from the printer, but also from the community. Especially for paper vouchers, but for e-vouchers, I think it's very, very clear. Unless people are providing, fraud can only happen when we are having people who are not supposed to be in the program receiving the e-vouchers. But for paper vouchers, you have to think about other security features that are not easy for people to duplicate, and also think about changing your voucher colors and security features as possible, so that people don't have this. Or someone said to like to hear more, which ones in particular. We have a framework of agreement with MasterCard, Segovia, and I wouldn't remember the third company, but it's at the global level, and it's in countries where we work or where MasterCard operates. But we also have within that GCTS, which is the Global Cash Transfer Solutions, as we call it, to bring forth service providers who work within their country. So it's not only locked that we must use the ones that we have frameworks of us with. It's a continuous process, so keep adding. We just started with a few who are vetted and maybe the document, part of the document with as part of materials for this webinar. Is there something else that I've missed to say?
We have a question about when is the right time to do reconciliation of cash transfers?
Finance. Okay, I have to do reconciliation, because otherwise then we have a lot of challenges being able to know, did we reach people, did we not reach people. It's easier if you're doing cash in envelopes. It's much more difficult when you're using service providers. So you must as well make sure that within the agreement with the service providers, you've agreed on the reconciliation period, so that you're not distributing cash for 1 year, and then after 1 year you actually realize there's some beneficiaries who just never redeemed. Maybe they died, maybe they moved from that locality. You don't know what happened to them. So you must, with the service provider, you have to agree with them a period that is conducive for them. It also depends on how long your cash transfer program is. So if you have a 3 month cash transfer with distributions every month, you cannot wait and do the reconciliation in the 4th month. Unfortunately, you will have to try and do the reconciliations after every month, so that you see you're on track. If you have a 1 year program that you're giving cash every 2 months, then you're doing reconciliations at that point in time. But it's sometimes very tricky when you're dealing with financial service providers, because of their own internal systems of reconciliation, which you have to make sure you're negotiating that you're getting the reconciliations after every distribution cycle, which is the ideal thing to do.
Okay, great. That is all the time we have for questions. If anyone else has any other questions, please do include them in the chat box still, because we will be collecting them and making a Q&A document that we will share with all attendees. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending this webinar. You will receive an email in your inbox shortly that will include a survey for this webinar that we would love for you to fill out, as well as the webinar recording and the presentation. Thank you, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, but I mean, can you